Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is a bit of an impromptu video. I wasn't planning on doing one on Newcastle's draw, 4-4 draw with Luton. I was at the Riverside Stadium for Middlesbrough against Sunderland on Sunday, and that was the video I was going to do. There seems to be a bit of a narrative that's followed on from the Luton game, and it's something that I really have an opinion on and wanted to share something about Dan Burn and his position. Obviously, he had a torrid time against Ogbene at the weekend, who really tore him apart at times down the right-hand side for Luton. Obviously conceded a penalty, and he was a big part of conceding the 4 goals on Saturday. That's a harsh reality for him, because many people, including myself, are a big fan of him. He's a lovely guy. I love speaking to him after games when I'm around, and yeah, he's very helpful. But right decision was made to take him off at the time. Probably should have been earlier, probably at half-time really, from that game for Tino Livramento, and that was what happened against Aston Villa. Eddie Howe took him off when Leon Bailey set up Ollie Watkins for the goal that pulled everything back and changed the momentum, and then that stunted the momentum change. And it was surprising that he didn't do that on Saturday, when at half-time at least, when it was 2-2, rather than waiting till the second half at 4-2 to react and bring Livramento on. Obviously, Newcastle then pulled it back to 4-4. There's a wider narrative that I want to talk about around Dan Burn and Newcastle, and this sort of tactical thing, and whether he's being exposed, whether he's the weak link, what the real situation is. And the truth is, I don't think Dan Burn is doing anything differently to what he did last season. I don't think he is performing abnormally poorly. I think it's a tactical issue that's now being exposed. It's a problem that with the way that Newcastle is setting up. Really, the answer to it is a system change and a different approach, rather than specifically altering anything that Dan Burn is doing. If you remember back to last season, Dan Burn was brought into the team off the back of an injury to Matt Targett at the start of last season, and he managed to stay because Newcastle found a system that worked. And Dan Burn is a centre-back by trade. He played at left-back at Brighton, but very rarely ventured forward. And when he came in at left-back for Targett last season, he usually stayed as part of a back three when Kieran Trippier would move forward and join attacks. He would then drop into a back three to make Newcastle really solid in the box. So that's why Newcastle didn't concede any goals. And it's also the reason why this season you've seen Dan Burn be too far in when the winger's running at him. And obviously people have wondered why he's too narrow, not closing in the winger too much. And that's been exposed quite a lot this season. The truth is, he wasn't doing that last season. The difference is that Newcastle are easier to breach in midfield, and teams are now able to expose the space that is available to them. Burn lacking the pace that he does, and being so unorthodox as a fullback, if you like, he is the obvious player to target. But the only issue is that teams are now able to do that. Last season, when it was all going so well, you had Bruno Guimaraes leading a press in midfield. You had Joelinton and Joe Willock, who had the energy and the pace and the intensity to really shut down any transitions. If you look at Saturday's game, it was pretty much all transition, and that's not going to suit a midfield of Louis Miley, Sean Longstaff and Bruno Guimaraes, because they don't have that energy level. They don't have that's not their game. So when you miss someone like Joe Willock, who brings the intensity and the physicality that he does, and the same thing with Joelinton, and also that was the plan for Sandro Tonali. He's very intense. He's very good in a battle. He's up for that sort of physicality and getting around the pitch and making Newcastle energetic and efficient in midfield. Newcastle have missed all 3 of those players for quite a lot of this season. But they're carried on playing the same way. So what you're finding is that the press isn't as resistant. Newcastle aren't as good in transition. Therefore, Bruno's being exposed, and therefore the space behind him is being exposed. And then teams are then obviously looking to target down the left-hand side for Newcastle, looking at Dan Burn. That's the real trouble here. It isn't to do with Dan Burn himself. Nothing that Dan Burn is doing is different to what he was doing last season. It's really stems from the fact that they have no Joe Willock and they have no Joelinton. Without those 2 players, Newcastle can't be as intense. They can't be as physically imposing on the opposition, and they can't play their own game as well. And I think a lot of people last season, when they were looking at the Tonali coming in or whoever the midfielder target was at the time, lots of people drew up first 11s without Joe Willock in it. And actually, I would argue he was Newcastle's player of the season last year, and stylistically and in terms of the way he plays, he's probably Newcastle's most important player. Without Willock and Joelinton as well, this system is very, very difficult to replicate. The real issue then is that Newcastle are still trying to play the same way. Why hasn't Eddie Howe changed it? Why hasn't he found a different way to play that fits the players that he's got at his disposal? Why is he so wedded to this style of play, this way of playing, this formation, this approach, when the players aren't there to execute it? I think that's really the bigger issue. And it's the sort of thing that if Eddie Howe doesn't sort this out and doesn't turn this round, that'll be the question that'll be asked. Dan Burn was exposed quite badly on Saturday by Ogbene, and he's been exposed against Samuel Chukwueze, obviously that goal against Milan. He's been exposed against Ousmane Dembele at times this season in the Champions League. Anthony Elanga as well. See, Ross Barkley found the space to bypass Newcastle's midfield because the intensity wasn't there. They were able to find him in that space that wouldn't be accessible last season because Willock and Joelinton were winning the ball so high and Bruno was sweeping up and regaining possession and making key passes high up the pitch. That's just not happening this season, and as a result everything else is falling apart. Dan Burn is therefore getting exposed, and he's being scapegoated, I would argue, because of a tactical issue with the way Newcastle are setting up. It's Eddie Howe's problem here, not Dan Burn's, and I think that's got to be looked at in the coming weeks with the situation with Joelinton not being fit for the rest of the season. Willock is coming back, we don't know when, but there has to be a change in terms of Dan Burn, and we've seen that Tino Livramento is able to live with that attack down the right because he's got more pace. That's just purely it, and Burn has survived and done very well in a system that suited him last season, but really the system only works when Joe Willock is there. If Joe Willock isn't there, and Joelinton, particularly both of those two together, then the whole system falls apart. And I think really that's a problem for Eddie Howe to work out. And the fact that he hasn't, and the fact that Newcastle are in this situation, is really more down to him than it is Dan Burn or the players. I know Burn got a lot of criticism on Saturday. We've been here with Miguel Almiron before as well, Sean Longstaff in the past as well, Jacob Murphy in the past. Players who I think will not be at the next phase. When Newcastle make the step up to the next phase, players like Burn, Almiron and Murphy will not be in the first team picture. And I think there's a feeling that those are the players that are holding Newcastle back. I disagree. I think Dan Burn's done very, very well up to his limitations, but he's being exposed because the system is allowing that. There's too much space in midfield. It's allowing players like Ross Barkley, Morgan Gibbs-White this season as well. It's allowed teams to run at Newcastle down the centre, teams to run at Newcastle down the right. Because the press isn't there, they're not solidified enough. Interestingly, they were against Aston Villa, and that's what kind of puzzled me on Saturday, was the fact that Newcastle had proven that, you know, Bruno can sit deep and Longstaff and Miley can protect that midfield and make it very difficult to breach. But they didn't do that. They went very expanded, as you would expect them to do at home. Luton were brave, and they saw where the weaknesses lay and carried on and went for it. And at 2-1, Newcastle were very complacent. I don't know why, though, there wasn't a message to Bruno just to sit back for a little bit, just to calm things down and allow Newcastle to get a little bit more control of the game, which they never really got. When a game is transitional like that with Willock and Joelinton in the team, it really actually suits Newcastle because they're so effective at winning the ball back. Bruno is so effective at finding the right pass in the attacking third. It works like clockwork. And Tonali would have been that sort of enforcing midfielder as well, high up the pitch in the number 8 position. That was the plan. Newcastle have been robbed of that, but at the same time they haven't reacted. And I think ultimately that's why people like Dan Burn are being exposed. So I think that needs to be kept into consideration when people are questioning Dan Burn. Maybe we should look more at Eddie Howe in the tactical situation. Thank you very much for joining me. Please like, share and subscribe. Also, I do have some copies of my book, Black and White Night, to sell. So if you want a copy of that, please DM me on Twitter. £15 for postage and packaging, and I'll sign it for you as well. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.